Great. Thanks so much, Dr. Rohr. Next, we have providing a regulatory perspective is Dr. James Smith. Dr. Smith is the Deputy Director in the Division of Clinical Policy and Office of New Drugs, Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Smith.
Thank you. And can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Fantastic. So thank you so much for having me today. It's been a great day and certainly a great panel, and I look forward to coming to hearing about what's coming next. You know, as I was reflecting on today's topic, you know, I spent about 8 years before going into a policy position within the Office of New Drugs in a review division, dealing with some of the rarest disorders all the way to some of the most prevalent. And there really are obviously very different challenges across the spectrum. But even among the most prevalent disorders, you know, as I was looking at the list of the top causes of mortality other than cancer, such as heart disease and lung disease, stroke, Alzheimer's disease, diabetes, kidney disease, but also those that cause significant morbidity like mental health disorders and osteoarthritis. From a drug development perspective, it's really amazing how heterogeneous even these disorders and diseases are. So, for example, with respect to available therapies, some of these disorders have hardly any truly, effective available therapies, whereas others have multiple classes, sometimes with substantial availability of generic products. The disorders vary, and especially if we include cancer now, they vary with respect to the understanding of the pathobiology to the extent that targeted therapies are possible. And as I've already heard today, it's often remarked that the market acceleration of oncology products was facilitated by a boom of the understanding of the pathophysiology of cancers, providing the options for targeted therapies, often with large effect sizes in certain patients. There may be, as was just mentioned, there may be varying degrees of regulatory certainty or precedent with respect to suitable endpoints for clinical trials. And especially when the pathophysiology of a disease may be multifactorial or not well understood, effect sizes are often anticipated to be rather modest, which can necessitate quite large trials to detect an effect with reasonable power. And on top of that, with some of the very prevalent diseases, especially if widespread prescribing is anticipated, there's often an expectation for a rather large safety database, especially if the effect size is expected to be small and if there are many safe and available therapies. But still, I believe that sponsors in academia and patient groups and regulators must really work together to tackle these challenges. If we think about the public health impact, even a drug with modest net clinical benefit, if taken by millions of patients, can have substantial absolute benefits to the public health, and obviously, if the benefits of the drug are larger than the public health benefits are of course even greater. So I'd like to offer a few thoughts from the perspective of evidence generation, and I won't pretend for a second to have all the answers. But as I noted, for many of these common chronic diseases, large clinical trials might be necessary, either to detect a treatment effect and or to ensure an adequate safety database. And so when such trials are necessary, we should really consider mechanisms to make them as efficient as possible. For example, COVID-19 is providing us experience with the use of master protocols that I hope could be leveraged for common diseases in the future. And although such trials require a great deal of upfront planning and collaboration among multiple stakeholders, I would hope that the accrual of experience by both industry and academics, as well as by regulators, will lower some of the barriers to such trial designs. Sometimes it seems that trials are designed because of an expectation of what, at least on the FDA side, what an FDA review division might want, because of what's been done before, trying to reduce regulatory risk. Um, but I would posit that I believe that there is more openness to innovative ideas than is often assumed, and so. I would challenge the community to challenge my colleagues, frankly, to try to push the envelope a little bit. For example, are the endpoints that are being proposed and the methods of analysis optimized? Of course, we have to start with the clinical question to be answered, but I think there's more room for innovative ideas here than is often recognized. I was struck recently by a meeting of the Cardiovascular and Renal Drugs Advisory Committee meeting where the Division of Cardiology and Nephrology expressed an interest in how we adjudicate cardiovascular events that I don't recall, and others can correct me, but I don't recall having been discussed for many years, if ever, and that was an interest in graded adjudication, whereby instead of adjudicators having to make a binary decision of yes or no whether or not an outcome event occurred, as an exploratory exercise and analysis, they re-adjudicated quote unquote negative events and assigned a consensus probability that the event might have occurred. And I thought that was a really fascinating approach. And in this particular case, the division ended up not using these analyses for labeling. But I think what I'm bringing it up as an example of is to, here we've been doing cardiovascular outcomes trials for decades, and there might be ways to innovate here that would actually provide more outcome events, if you will. And for an event-driven trial, the number of outcome events matter. And so and improve efficiency. So I think we have room for innovation in areas where we might have thought were rather stagnant before. And reevaluating endpoints doesn't need to involve such novel procedures either. I think as the patient perspective has been brought up, play a greater role in drug development, and we start to think about what matters more to patients, and sometimes perhaps we should be considering symptom-based endpoints rather than hard outcomes in certain cases. We might find other ways of improving efficiency, such as taking continuous variables and stopping dichotomizing them in ways that can reduce statistical power. But also, I think, as has been mentioned, I think that the time is ripe to consider how we're collecting clinical endpoints. And I think there's multiple opportunities for exploring innovative ideas here. There's no doubt that the current COVID-19 public health emergency is going to teach us a great deal about the performance of a variety of methods of conducting clinical trials. For example, in our guidance regarding the conduct of clinical trials during COVID-19, from the very first publication, we noted that it may be necessary to collect safety and efficacy assessments in alternative ways, virtual assessments, for example. And in our updated guidance regarding developing drugs for treatment or prevention of COVID-19, which we published just a little over a week ago, we recognize the important role of decentralized clinical trials, or DCTs, in COVID-19 drug development. And these are trials in which some or all trial-related procedures and data acquisition take place at locations remote from the investigator. And whether we're considering COVID-19 or common chronic disease, it seems that a decentralized trial design may be able to help us reach additional patient populations who perhaps would not have been included into clinical trials before. and we might be able to reduce burden on trial participants, and perhaps improve trial efficiency. It won't be always appropriate, and certainly there will be there are factors that should be thought of about whether or not these sorts of approaches are appropriate or not for a given product or indication. But I think there's room, and I think folks within the agency are certainly eager to see how some of these methods can be used. And another topic of great interest, of course, is how to best leverage data that's being collected in clinical practice to generate evidence, whether from electronic health records, medical claims data, or other such sources. And as I'm sure this audience is well aware, FDA has multiple efforts underway with respect to evaluating the potential for real-world evidence to support various regulatory decisions. And often, real-world evidence seems to be equated with observational data, but it's important to remember that a randomized controlled trial that's conducted in a healthcare setting, in which outcomes are identified from an electronic health record, for example, is also an example of real-world evidence. And I would hope that such trials would have great promise, and I would love to see all the various stakeholders partner together to identify the current barriers and to devise solutions to make quality trials of this type a more frequent occurrence. And last, I'll touch on something that I was struck by in the previous remarks about just the number of data points that are collected in clinical trials. And especially when we're talking about potentially the need for conducting large trials if we expect smaller effect sizes or whatnot. I think we really do need to think about, what is the absolute, what are the absolutely necessary data points to collect? And this can be thought of on both the efficacy side and the safety side. Certainly, patient safety is paramount in clinical trials, and I would not want to suggest otherwise. But it's fairly typical for us to see protocols that include comprehensive safety data collection regardless of the stage of drug development, even after approval, with the collection of voluminous laboratory data and EKGs and physical exams and non-serious adverse events. And one must stop and wonder how much actionable new information is likely to come in some of these trials. And FDA published a guidance about 5 years ago regarding determining the need of the extent of safety data collection in late stage pre-market and post-approval clinical investigations. And you may be aware that there's an ongoing ICH effort that's patterned after this guidance, the development of ICH E19. And so I think there are opportunities to scale back on some of the data collection that occurs to hopefully help some of these trials be accomplished with lower barriers, at lower cost, more efficiently. Obviously, we recognize that different regulatory authorities around the world require, or at least have different expectations, and trials are often done globally now. And so this is a ripe area for international harmonization. So it'll be interesting to see where those efforts will lead. So to sum up in a high level, I would say that we are certainly very interested in collaborating with stakeholders to contemplate mechanisms to promote effective and efficient drug development for prevalent chronic diseases. And I would hope that taking an innovative look at trial designs, endpoints, extent of data collection, as well as the mechanisms for collecting data could all contribute to improving our ability to answer important scientific questions. So I'll end there, and I look forward to the discussion.